Hello and welcome to Profiles and Issues, the Westchester Cable Television talk show that gives you in-depth interviews with prominent people in the news. I'm your host, Dennis Rudin. Due to the coronavirus, we are taping this program on Zoom for broadcast on our Optimum and FiOS local cable channels before the June 23rd primary. Go to our website at thedennisrudenshow.com for additional viewing information. And don't forget to vote in the primary by absentee ballot or in person. Our topic for this broadcast, the 2020 Democratic Congressional Primary Race in the 17th Congressional District. This seat will be vacated by Nita Lowey at the end of this year. My special guest for this broadcast is Democratic congressional candidate Adam Schleifer. Adam, welcome to Profiles and Issues.
Hi, Dennis, and thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be with you here, at least in the digital and remote sense.
Well, it's a new experience for me, but this is what the world of technology brings us.
Yep.
So let's get started. Many people would say that these last 3 months have been one of the most difficult and challenging periods in the history of our country, state, and county, with both the coronavirus and recently the tragic and brutal murder, as witnessed on video, of George Floyd, an African American, by a police officer in Minnesota. As a former federal prosecutor, and I assume you've worked with police departments, were you surprised when this happened? And do you think our current police system promotes systemic racism and violence?
So, was I surprised, Dennis? I'm not sure if I was surprised. I know my conscience was shocked, as were the consciences of so many Americans, as we've seen in their righteous and effective and constructive indignation over the past few weeks since that event. It was appalling. It was shocking to see. Unfortunately, it was not the first time we've seen an excess of force, a form of racial violence by a person in uniform, or a form of police brutality. We've seen too many of those examples. I would say that was one of the worst that we've seen. The officer on back of Mr. Floyd's neck looked as though he could have been having a cup of coffee and checking his phone, and cared very little about the fact that he was causing a man to expire beneath his leg. His fellow officers did nothing to try to stop that situation, to try to see if Mr. Floyd was still breathing. Mr. Floyd was no threat. It's clear from the video through the entirety of those 8+ minutes. And so that was a terrible, horrible form of murder committed, but it just so happens, by people in uniform.
Is it possible, from your vantage point, being, a former federal prosecutor, to change the mentality of the criminal justice system with regard? And I know that there are many good people in it. I've seen it with my own eyes, but I've also seen negative situations. Is it possible to change? Can we introduce either some kind of reform, or they talk about dismantling or defunding? What's your view on this?
Yeah, I think I want to start from let's take a few steps back. I'll go super historical, and then we'll go to the police. So I think it's important to say, as I've been saying to our citizens in our district, that we need to take a step back and think maybe at least from 1619, when the original sin of our country was at its inception, when we started our horrible relationship with African American slavery. And then it went through to 1776, when we had a framer of our great country's ideals named Thomas Jefferson, who of course was a slave owner, as were many, write inspiring words about self-evident truths that they held to, truths that they held to be self-evident, inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He mentioned, of course, a string of long usurpations and indignities. Of course, for them, that was just mercantile tax policy. Meanwhile, of course, they were keeping other men and women in bondage in their own homes. And so we have to realize that we started with this original sin as a country. We fought a civil war. We passed 3 constitutional amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, to purge ourselves of that sin. And the minute the Union Army left the South, there was another 100 years of Jim Crow, and African Americans were denied the franchise, subjected to brutal over-incarceration in almost every Southern state. That created an artificial, free, working labor force for white Southerners. And so this history of oppression is not only old, but it's been with us at least up until the 1960s, when Martin Luther King first awakened the conscience of the United States. And so it's important to start from that history. Now, in that time, we passed a lot of important laws, and we passed civil rights laws, and some of those laws prohibit, and the federal government has the duty to enforce those laws, prohibit the violation of civil rights. Now, let me tell you about that a little bit.
I have to tighten it up a little because of the time. Okay.
Well, let me just tell you that it's important. What did I do as a federal prosecutor? I worked for my boss and mentor, Mr. Lawrence Middleton. And Mr. Lawrence Middleton was a black man who grew up in the South, who became a JAG officer, and then he became a federal prosecutor. And when he was a young federal prosecutor, he prosecuted the police officers and got successful convictions against the police officers who violated the civil rights of Mr. Rodney King. So when you ask, is there something that can be done? The DOJ, through the FBI, and through federal prosecutors like my colleagues, had the duty and in fact have successfully prosecuted similar horrible cases in history. They must continue to do so. And so I am proud to say that my colleagues were among those who did that, who put the corrupt sheriff of Los Angeles in jail and got a conviction against him a few years ago, a sitting sheriff of Los Angeles County. And so there is a tremendous role for law enforcement to do the right thing. That's one. But two, we also need to reform our existing ancillary federal laws, including removing qualified immunity, which is a doctrine that's too complicated and too unfair and doesn't work and doesn't drive the results we need in terms of justice. We need a federal database for police misconduct, and we need to have federal funding conditioned upon anti-bias and implicit bias and other bias trainings by our law enforcement officers, so that we have properly educated them and properly reform the system to ensure these things don't happen. All that said, I agree with you. There are many outstanding, valorous, hardworking men and women in our law enforcement ranks throughout this country. I've met many of them. I've relied on many of them to do justice at all levels in state and federal government. And we must continue to both support their important work while demanding that everybody honor the promises of the Constitution, particularly vis-a-vis our African Americans who have not been given their full rights and have never enjoyed the full promise of our Constitution.
Okay, when you said, and I want to be specific, you don't have to give me long explanations. It's pertinent that the public knows what side you're on. Are you in favor of the transparency of disciplinary records of police officers? I think they call it 50A here in New York State. Governor Cuomo spoke about that. Are you in favor of that?
So that's a state issue, 50A, but certainly as a federal representative, I think we need to have a strong federal and state framework of information, as I said, including potentially a federal database, so that officers can essentially run away from prior misconduct and get employed elsewhere without a full and complete vetting of records.
Because they run from state to state.
That's the point.
And things like, well, you tell me, as I mention these things, if you have any ideas how they could be implemented on the federal level, tell me, because you are running for Congress.
Yeah.
The banning of chokeholds.
Yeah, I mean, Barack Obama said this last week in a Medium.com article. Most of the policing practices where the rubber meets the road is the state level. So I think we have a role in the federal government to define what does or doesn't violate federal law and constitutional rights. But I think most of the policy changes about what each police department can and can't do, again, is mostly a matter for the state level. But I certainly believe that we have to look at the kinds of chokeholds that kill people wantonly and say those are violations of even existing federal law.
Okay. And also this term defunding, and this is why I'm bringing it to you. Although they talk about it on the state level, it affects the federal level because in conversations that I've heard, certain police departments have like tanks and armor and all these things to go into cities. Is that something, in your view, that police departments should have? Maybe there should be a relocation and a reallocation of resources. Maybe it ought to start with federal legislation. What do you think?
I definitely don't agree that the first solution to the problems we have is just to take away money from law enforcement. The
Okay.
solution needs to be to ensure that law enforcement follows the law and to change the law to make sure that they're not violating people's rights. So rather than just say, let's just take away the money, I don't think that will solve the problem. I think we need to look at how to make sure the money we spend is spent on things like proper training, rooting out bad apples, prosecuting.
How would you root out bad apples?
Well, first of all, with
ideas?
better training and periodic review of training, with better records so that we know bad apples when they exist, with stronger forms of federal law, including removing qualified immunity. So when someone sues and says my rights were violated, we don't have this artificial two-step under the case of Harlow and versus Fitzgerald, which this whole area of qualified immunity obscures the law and makes it harder to establish federal precedents when it comes to what is and is not legal from the perspective of federal law. So there's all sorts of things we need to do to improve this. I think saying defund is a strange way to go about it. What we should be saying is demand better. And then let's figure out what that means and what the budget is. Maybe we can save some money there, but I never saw a problem that has ever existed in the world where the answer is, we have a problem, let's just take away a lot of money and hope it gets better. So that's probably not the first thing I would do.
All right. Most of the people on the other side of the spectrum, on the prosecutorial side, most of the people that demonstrated against the death of George Floyd, I thought behaved admirably, but there were groups of people looting, especially in New York City, that destroyed millions of dollars of property and stole goods. Should they be allowed just bail and a few days in jail? Or I'm thinking of younger, people and people underage, or forced into participating in a public works program that shows them the value of hard work and makes them realize the destruction that they caused.
So I want to start by pointing out, I'm so proud of our district because I marched in Rockland last week in their Black Lives Matter march in Nyack. I was at the NAACP of Peekskills, amazing demonstration in a park two weekends ago. This past weekend, I joined Mayor Rainey of Peekskill for a rally with what must have been at least 1,000 people or more, filled an entire football field, basically. And everywhere in this district, we have had constructive anger and righteous indignation. We've exercised our First Amendment rights peaceably to assemble to petition grievances. So I want to say, that's not a problem we're having in this district. And the reason I want to point that out is because we had someone in Rockland County, and the executive of Rockland County, send out a very counterproductive message a few weeks ago saying that they would come down, quote unquote, with extreme prejudice.
But as a member of Congress, you may have legislation like this brought in front of you. So that's the reason why I asked.
Sorry, what kind of legislation?
As a future member of Congress, you may have legislation brought in front of you to vote on that concerns areas that had trouble, worse than Westchester County.
There's no federal law that's going to dictate what the state penalties would be for someone who looted in New York City. That's just not a subject of federal law. But I would say, if you're asking me as a former...
no, but they looted all over the country, too, in other places.
Right.
So that's why it may affect you in Congress, as
Yeah, I wouldn't speculate on what one person's punishment should be for a violation of a law. It's just sort of, I'd have to see each individual case. I would say, though, we've had an outpouring of anger in this country. Anytime you get a large crowd of people together, there's always going to be some folks who intentionally want to cause mischief for other reasons. You're always going to have all sorts of problems. If you get 10,000 people in one block in the city, something's going to happen. And so, yeah, I don't know that we can draw any tremendous lessons about the examples, damaging as they were, unfortunate as they were, and frankly destructive to the movement as they were, from those examples.
Okay, this past Tuesday, Westchester County entered phase 2 of the Back to Work program. So far, 24,000 New Yorkers died from the coronavirus in Westchester and 2,600 in the Hudson Valley. Uh, as a result of the coronavirus and the death of George Floyd, have you had to rethink any of your original priorities that you had when you first uh, put forth your candidacy for running for Congress? And by that I meant, funding.
Yeah. So I think from the broad perspective, no, because from the very beginning of this campaign, what I've been pushing for is pragmatic, data-driven, scientist-led, and scientist-engaged governance, where we listen to experts and we follow the data. We ask the tough questions, as I've always done in my career, and we follow the answers wherever they go. So from that perspective, I actually think coronavirus showed us who does that and who doesn't. Governor Cuomo leaped into the breach that we had because of President Trump, and he did a great job of doing pragmatic, effective, cohesive, and even provisional governance, where he didn't know all the answers. We still don't know all the answers, but he knew that based on what we knew, let's figure what that is and listen to the experts and make the best decisions we can. So from that perspective, no. What it did change was my sense early on, which I called for almost immediately, which was we got to get cash into people's hands during this kind of crisis, because 80% of Americans can't miss more than 3 paychecks without going seriously broke because they have no savings. And 70% of our economy is consumer driven. So when I saw what was going on and I realized we'd have months of quarantine, I was joining the calls, although I have fewer followers so far, but I was joining the calls of Andrew Yang and Mitt Romney, who were both agreeing from both sides of the spectrum, get cash in people's hands. I think we still need to get more cash in people's hands, most likely. I'm concerned about a boomerang. But yeah, it did change. Responding to that meant I think we needed to look at more cash in people's hands, stimulation that goes to even companies to require them not to lay off their workers if they take the money, and requires them not to do stock buybacks and not to do dividends. But we needed to stimulate the companies too, so that people aren't laid off and forced to go on COBRA or go without health insurance in the middle of a health crisis. The other thing it affected is, as I've been saying all along, we need a strong public option that people can buy into that's affordable and effective, so that if they are not employed, there's some place for them to go. We need to expand Obamacare and make sure that the 8.5% of Americans who aren't covered get covered.
It's with health care. One of the problems that people have with the health care, even people that have insurance, and, in a way this strikes close to you, because I believe your dad is in the pharmaceutical industry. Some of us who have insurance, we're still, some of these drug prescriptions, even with insurance, are off the wall. One person who was a diabetic told me that for their injectables, with their donut hole, before they reach that, they're paying like $500 just for an injectable a month, and they have insurance. If they didn't, it would be much higher. Is there any way we can control? I mean, pharmaceutical companies don't operate this way in other countries. You have any ideas on that?
Yeah, sure. We need a cap on out-of-pocket expenses for drug costs. I support that. We need to have an absolute cap on the amount of money that any person, starting with seniors, but everybody pays for out-of-pocket for drug costs. And we need to force insurance companies to cover the drugs that exist when they don't cover them. There's all sorts of preventative medical advances, like cholesterol-lowering drugs, other drugs that often don't get covered. And I've asked doctors, well, why wouldn't the insurance companies want to cover those costs? Because it'll prevent the ICU bill that they'll have to pay. And they said, it's because by the time that person has a heart attack, they'll be on somebody else's insurance because they will have changed jobs. That's why I hope long-term public option, Medicare for those who want it, can outcompete private plans, so that people don't have that problem, so that the government is incentivized to have preventative care, to fund mental health, and do all that. So yeah, I support efforts to cap out-of-pocket expenses that anyone has to pay for insurance costs, among other things. And I also agree with you. You pointed out the insulin issue. We need to come down hard at the FTC, the DOJ, and elsewhere on companies that drive up artificially costs for long existing non-innovative technologies and products, like insulin, like EpiPen, adrenaline that people were having problems with a few years ago, like antibiotics that guy Martin Shkreli cornered the market for and then charged insane prices for not innovating anything. So there's a role even for our civil and criminal law enforcement to make sure that we don't have anti-competitive and illegal practices where people are artificially cornering markets. We need to support innovators. We've got thousands of employees in this county who work in the biotech and biopharmaceutical industry generating life-saving treatments. We want to make sure they keep doing that, but we also need to separate the productive activity from the unproductive activity, and I'm all for that.
Good. All right. Over the last several months, I'm sorry, it's been more, I'd say over the last year or two, there's been a rise in ethnic and religious hate crimes in both Westchester and Rockland County, especially anti-Semitism. What actions would you take on the federal level to help combat these violent actions?
Yes. So there were two men, Mr. Matthew Shepard and Mr. I think it's Thomas Bird. And one was a gay man and one was a black man. And one was murdered, I believe, in the Midwest for his sexuality. And the other one was dragged, I believe, through the streets of a Texas town and brutally tortured and murdered because he was a black man. And the federal government passed the Hate Crime Prevention Act in their honor. And it's a beautiful law because it protects everyone on account of their race, religion, ethnicity, sex, and sexual identity from being subjected to violence and murder. And I have to say, when that horrible attack happened in Muncie, I went and visited the folks who were the victims right as soon as I could. And I sat with them and I felt their pain in their homes. And I told them, as the grandson of a Holocaust survivor, as someone who understood what hate and anti-Semitism does in the world, how it destroys families. 80 members of my grandfather's family all were killed. Nobody survived. He was the only one who escaped. Mm-hmm. So my grandparents fled after the Holocaust, after surviving that kind of hate. So I told those folks in Muncie that I sat with, the victims of that heinous crime, that I will be stronger in protecting them on this issue and rooting out domestic terror and all forms of hate, including anti-Semitism, than anybody ever, because nothing matters more to me. And I called for the enforcement of that statute, and I'm very glad to see the United States Attorney's Office from the Southern District of New York since having indicted that man under that statute, because that statute sends a message to everybody in our country that you're all entitled to protection, and we just need to enforce it and bring the stiff federal penalties that comes with that. In addition, Governor Cuomo did something great, which I support, which is put in things like license plate readers and formed a committee on combating anti-Semitism. And Rep. Carolyn Maloney in the city, in New York City, and others in Congress, I believe Congresswoman Lowy and Adam Schiff and others are co-sponsors of the Holocaust education bill that's going through, so that we can teach our young people just how pernicious anti-Semitism is. And that's another part of the solution.
All right. Would you work to establish an interagency task force on hate crimes in Congress?
Seems like a good idea to me.
All right. So you heard it here. Okay, fine. Do you have any legislative priorities and committees that you would like to serve on when you get to Congress?
At least three. I mean, I like to say I'll be thrilled to go wherever Speaker Pelosi sends me if I'm lucky enough to represent the district.
Okay.
But my priorities would probably start with my expertise. So judiciary. I was a employee of the United States federal judiciary for 2 years. I've clerked for 2 different federal judges, both in the district court and the Court of Appeals. So the judiciary would be one, and ethics would be another. I was a frauds prosecutor. I think it's sad to say, but true, that we need frauds prosecutors who understand how to investigate fraud and ethics violations more than ever in government. So ethics and judiciary are 2. The other one would be, energy and commerce, because through that committee, so many critical things go, including our public health regulatory functions of the FDA, how we deal with energy, which is a key aspect of the environment. So I think those 3 would be 3 committees I'm prioritizing. But again, wherever Speaker Pelosi sends me, I'll be thrilled to go.
Okay, now I want you to look into your camera or your computer. I want you to tell the people out there, the voters, why they should vote for you. What special, why they should vote for you for Congress.
Yeah, I think my case to all of you voters would be, I'm the only one in this race with both state and federal experience. I've been a consumer protection regulator for New Yorkers under Governor Cuomo, where I took on predatory payday lending practices that were taking advantage of hardworking New York borrowers. I fought for our markets and our effective markets by making them fair and transparent. I fought for everyday people and solved everyday problems as both a regulator and a prosecutor. I used to teach constitutional law. I've published in the area. I have a complete expertise of how the federal government works. And my background and my energy in getting real things done for real people, I believe, is unique in this race. And I'm so excited to continue my hard work in public service on behalf of everyone in this district.
Adam Schleifer, thank you for coming on Profiles and Issues. We wish you the best of luck in your race for Congress.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Thank you for doing this. I hope to see you in person before too long.
I hope so too. And also, thank you for your public service in the past. We need good people to step forward, especially in these trying times.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that's it for this edition of Profiles and Issues. This is Dennis Rudin saying so long until the next time.